Welcome back. So you may already have gone home, you may already be on holiday at the moment as the holiday season sort of gets going. Look, I don't know what a holiday season is in 2020, but officially we're on holiday. Government has started a new campaign to try and keep us safer on the roads as the great festive season rush starts. Joining me now, the transport expert, Ofensa Mokwena. Ofensa, good afternoon to you. I mean, the Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula wants us to honk our horn at midday every day for road safety. I've got to tell you, I'm struggling to think that that's going to make a huge difference.
Well, I think thank you for having me, and good afternoon to everyone who's watching. I think it's a gesture, and the whole idea is to get everybody to respond and react and engage with the idea.
We've tried so many things over the years to make our roads safer. What initiatives actually work?
Well, so there are three main pathways for this. So we do have a road safety strategy, and the road safety strategy spreads a number of programs and initiatives over almost a 5-year period. And the first phase is basically enabling the road safety management to actually take place. So that would be municipalities, provinces, and obviously national government. And that's usually the first phase. But what really makes road safety initiatives and programs work is if you understand the transportation system and infrastructure, you have marketing and communication, and you focus on sustainable, positive roadway use. It's not just a campaign that's only one part of the kind of interventions that are necessary.
So you have a whole lot of things going together. I mean, let me sort of put some elements of all of this to you. I mean, so for example, I mean, a lot of people blame our drivers and the sort of driving culture. And I realize that countries do, to an extent, have a sort of driving culture. I mean, I think, I don't know if you can really define that. But how much of this is about our driving?
Well, most of the fatalities are caused by human behavior. And it's errors in maybe judgment, lapses in decision making when you're either crossing a road as a pedestrian or you are driving and you basically are making a bad choice. In many cases, it's associated with alcohol consumption, but there are also some softer issues that are associated with the infrastructure, so the way in which the road is designed and planned out. Most of our fatalities, well, not most, but little over a third of our fatalities involve pedestrians, and most of our campaigns tend to take place along highways. And that's a bit of a weird scenario because the real impact for road safety is in the change of behavior on one hand, but also on the other hand in targeting the most vulnerable, who are people who are basically are not driving, they're not moving inside a cocoon, they're not protected by anything other than the behavior of a driver.
It's fascinating that, because I mean, from a very young age here and in most other countries, you're sort of taught from a young age to look right, look left, look right again, because we drive on the left and that's where you start. But if you look at the structure of our society, you have informal settlements, and then close to them you might have employment opportunities, a job, and between them you'll have a highway that's got no fence whatsoever. I mean, it's pretty obvious what's going to happen.
Yes, and it's actually particularly important in the African environment, African highway environment. And what we know is that there's a lot of research that's being done around the subject, around pedestrian crossing highways, because even when there's a pedestrian bridge, you do find that people still prefer to cross on highways. And it's an African phenomenon. And there are a number of factors that influence this. But at the same time, the nature of our roadway design in conjunction with the nature of our urban settlements is, it's basically a recipe for disaster, unless if we start introducing the right kind of mechanisms to control the way in which people use the roadways. And not just people as in the pedestrians, but also people as in the drivers.
I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, we can't change the structure of the society very quickly. We can't really easily move informal settlements away from highways. There are a couple of other things we can do. I mean, about 10 years ago, we were all told to drive with our headlights on even during the day so that our cars would be more visible, especially driving at speed. If I recall, there was a plan actually to get people who are likely to be pedestrians, and particularly people, how do I put this, people who are likely to imbibe alcohol, to wear bright colored clothing. I mean, are those things that actually make any difference whatsoever?
Well, I think we need to sort of take a step back around, what kind of road safety interventions are we doing? Are we doing interventions that deal with the road safety situation right now? So you're trying to reduce the 13,000, 14,000 fatalities, or are we introducing road safety interventions that are trying to improve the long-term trajectory of the way in which people use the roadways? And that would basically involve incorporating K53 in the life orientation at high school, primary school. It will also involve designing interventions that basically enable municipalities to have money to do road safety campaigns, and the other things that I could mention. But really, if we look at it at face value, there are things that we're doing just for the short term, but actually road safety is something that comes from a longer term intervention, because it's part of human settlements, it's part of public works, it's part of tourism, it's part of education. So it's a really long-term and very complex program of efforts that you need to see the results that you're looking for.
As I understand it, there are two countries who have actually done quite well here. I think one is Sweden and the other might be Britain. They've managed to bring down pedestrian deaths and just general road deaths quite dramatically. It did take them 20 years. And what they did is a series of things, but in suburban areas, places anywhere near a school, anywhere near residential areas, you can't drive at more than 40 kilometers an hour. They have speed bumps literally everywhere. The average speed that people drive in those suburbs has dropped dramatically. I mean, it's almost walking pace. But those are very different societies to ours. For a start, the countries aren't as big. The distances that you have to drive aren't as long. And the longer the distance, the more likely you are to take the car up to 120.
Yes. So on one hand, at neighborhood level, what we've seen in the COVID situation is that a lot more movement is happening in the neighborhoods. And for neighborhoods to work effectively and to become really safe, you need to calm traffic. And calming traffic involves just basically designing roadways in such a way that that drivers are subconsciously forced to drive slower. But on the other hand, you create a safe environment for people to walk and cycle, and obviously to jog as well, because that's a big thing nowadays. But then when you look at it at a macro level in the South African context, we are confronted with what you just mentioned, low densities, long distances, and that just means people will be susceptible to reaching those speeds. But it's not just the speeds that are a problem, really. I think much of it is the few individuals who are basically interacting with the roadway in such a way that they violate a contract of trust that they basically sign just by having a driver's license. And that's the situation that we're in at this point in time. It's really a small minority that is at the forefront of basically making terrible decisions consciously. In other cases, you have actual accidents. It's really a mistake, or the tire burst, or the vehicle, the driver lost control of the vehicle, or just a lapse in judgment on the side of the pedestrian, or the pedestrian is drunk. But overall, the factors are really complex. All we can do is to introduce the right kind of instruments to prevent this, and funding is a big issue.
I mean, one thing you could do is just reduce traffic on long distances, and one way you could do that is to make flying in a plane cheaper, which is probably unlikely, but you could have more cheaper, more efficient, and more routes on the railways. I mean, that would make a huge difference, wouldn't it, to the amount of, if you had families going, to the Eastern Cape from Gauteng, say, which already I think can take over 24 hours on a train. If you could do that in a few hours, if you could take a train to Durban more quickly than you can now, people would do that.
Yeah, it's actually one of the calculations that, or it's one of the measures that you use to justify railway investments, the cost of lives that are saved. And of course, we can't measure the value of a human life, but generally, you can associate the 147 billion rand in terms of accident costs with, the potential benefits of having an efficient and effective public transport system, long distance transport system, including railways and aviation. However, what we don't have at the moment in our country is a strategic position around long distance travel. And that's basically opened up an entire vacuum for the market to do whatever it wants, even though it's not necessarily in line with our technical ambitions. I mean, 1.9 million people were exposed to road traffic crashes, and only 600,000 of those were injured, and about 14,000 have passed away, and that was in 2017. And what you're looking at is basically a massive number of people who've been exposed to crashes. Imagine what that would mean if every person's valuation was at 1,000 Rand or more.
It's huge numbers. We do need to talk a little bit about speed, and I realize speed comes in there's sort of different sort of sectors of conversation around speed. I know plenty of people who say if we drop the national speed limit from 120 to 100 or even to 80, there'll be a major difference. I know there might be some data because there have been times, say in American history, for example, when the speed limit was lower than it is now to save fuel because of oil embargoes in the 70s. The problem we might have here is compliance. In other words, would people actually obey the speed limit? And again, it goes back to those long distances. I don't know if speed really makes that much of a difference.
Well, speed is a serious killer because, over 60 kilometers an hour, a pedestrian dies. And neighborhood roadways tend to be around that speed, so, and driving below that is an inconvenience for everybody else who's trying to drive at 60 kilometers an hour. So that's a significant challenge in the South African market. But then on highways, there's some conflicting evidence. On one hand, people driving at higher speeds, sober, tend to behave like it's an Autobahn scenario where you basically just have to take responsibility for your driving behavior. On the other hand, sometimes people driving at speeds without the relevant proficiency in driving tend to expose everybody else to even much greater risk. And that's where the challenges with speed comes in. Of course, a lot of analysis is required to figure out what would actually work in the South African context. But what is clear is that a deadly speed in neighborhoods is 60 kilometers an hour. And, if you really care about children, then you probably want to create a neighborhood environment that facilitates much slower driving speeds. And speed humps are only one way of getting to that.
And then we have to talk a little bit about minibus taxis. I mean, one of the reasons that our number of people who die is so high is because in one accident involving a taxi, you could have 10 or 11 people who are killed. I mean, a lot kind of rests on that industry, and they're not always as well equipped to sort of manage this problem.
Yeah, to be really clear, the minibus taxi industry is a bit complex because on one hand you have a vehicle configuration problem. It's very difficult to be in a taxi and wear a seatbelt. It's virtually uncomfortable. So the configuration of the taxi itself is almost not susceptible to a very safe kind of setup. The second thing is what we saw with regard to these panel vans that were converted into public transport vehicles, and this kind of trend obviously exposed a lot of people to very fatal situations. Then the third factor is how can we create a situation where the technical characteristics of the vehicle and of the driver enable a safer roadway experience for the passengers. And that it goes both ways. It's, yes, on one hand the driver, on the other hand it's the technical design of the vehicles themselves, specifically for people to wear seatbelts, because that could probably save a couple of lives.
Well, Vincent Mokoena, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed, transport analyst. Really appreciate the time this Friday afternoon.